Greetings, everyone. The Roman Empire was one of the greatest superpowers in history. It lasted for over 500 years, from 31 BC until its fall in 476 AD. In its heyday, it was number one militarily, economically, and politically. It won its wars, expanded its borders, and prospered continually, year after year. But then it started to decline, unravel, and slowly but surely decay until it totally collapsed. This seemed impossible. How could the great Roman Empire ever cease to exist? But it did cease to exist and is nowhere to be found on this earth today. Why did this giant nation decline and fall? What caused its demise? I want to quote from a wonderful little booklet entitled The Modern Romans. This was published by Ambassador College in 1971. Notice what the introduction says. Rome fell, a fact of history, but why? The reasons have never been fully understood. The lessons have not been learned. Many of the same basic mistakes that weakened the once mighty Roman Empire before its toppling by barbarian hordes are now being repeated in America, Britain, and the Western world. And they go on to amplify this very astute observation in the introduction of this booklet. I'm now reading on page 9 of The Modern Romans. Massive public works, striking architecture, cosmopolitan cities, masters of advanced warfare, bureaucratic institutions, a melting pot, and more. These descriptions are as valid of Rome's past achievements as they are of ours in our dizzyingly sophisticated modern Western world. In its time in history, the Roman Empire occupied a position of power and influence very similar to that held by the United States or Western civilization in our time. We know more about the Romans than any other great civilization of antiquity, and interestingly enough, the Roman Empire covered an area approximately the size of the United States. The United States and the Rome of past glory both started as struggling, insignificant colonies of people ruled over by a monarchy. This booklet goes on to say, injustices led to revolution and establishment of a republic. Still later, after extensive expansions, they both were torn apart by civil war. But then each settled down and rose to heights of undisputed world power and leadership, both the Roman Empire and the United States of America and its allies. There's the similarities described right there. Let's continue. The Roman superpower could boast, just like American or Western counterparts, of their possession of a highly developed system of law and justice, government and order, and without doubt, production of goods and services. Western civilization, in fact, prides itself on its Roman legacy. But Rome crumbled. When Seneca, the Roman statesman, warned that Rome would fall, the people snickered. Rome fall? It could lose a few battles, but not the empire. Rome, mused the average citizen basking in the height of world power, is impregnable. Rome was the world, and the world was Rome. That was the hue and cry of the day. To speculate at the moment of unsurpassed material, economic, and military achievements that glorious Rome could collapse to inferior barbarians was unthinkable. What Roman Jeremiah could have prophesied that the ravages of wars, taxation, mounting crime, race problems, moral decay, subversion from within, political assassinations, and public apathy, not to exclude natural disasters, would one day bring Rome prostrate before less developed nations. Would lay them flat, and it happened. But who would have thought it? But the voices of the ancient Roman scoffers are as still as the rubble of ancient Rome. Christian in name at the end of the 5th century, the Holy Roman Empire, church and state, the empire in the West obviously didn't have divine protection from the barbarian hordes that overran her. No nation that fails to fully respect and live by God's true moral standards ever does, and history proves that point. And we will not continue either if we do not change the direction that we're going in this beautiful country we live in, the United States of America, and Britain and the rest of the Western world. And what is that direction that we're going in? We're going away from God and we're not fully respecting and living by his true moral standards. Will we get the point in our civilization today? Continuing to read from this booklet, The Modern Romans. Fortunately, Roman history is fairly well documented. The Romans built a highly advanced society for their time. To them it was even a quote-unquote great society. They developed and used many techniques and achievements common to our modern way of life. They were the Americans and Britons and Canadians and Australians and South Africans and Western Europeans of their day. They were the ones who had wealth, a high level of culture, fantastic buildings, bureaucratic institutions, and sprawling cities, prodigious engineers, high-rise apartment houses, the cosmetic arts, spectator sports, sightseers, and tourists. These also are words used to describe Roman activity in the 2nd century A.D., the time when Rome was at the height of its power. They constructed roads all over their vast empire, roads surpassed only in recent times. Some are still in use today. Roman engineers built a road network equal to 10 times the circumference of the earth at the equator. Did you know that civilization was that developed? Well, you study history, and you'll see they're right in saying this. Some of you have probably been to areas where the Roman Empire had extended. I know I have, and you will see that what's being written here and said is absolutely true. It's not myth, it's not conjecture. It's still there for us to see, although in a decaying condition. But you know what? Some were built so well, these roads, that they're still in use today, and not in a decaying condition. And they didn't hesitate to cut through hills, tunnel through mountains, build sturdy bridges over rivers and valleys. Their freeways ran as straight and flat as possible. How do we know this? Because you can go and see them today. They used concrete hardly inferior to ours and just as durable. They even developed a cement that would harden underwater. That's how advanced this society was. That's how fantastic and amazing this empire became. How could anyone from any place on earth ever penetrate, defeat, and destroy this mighty Roman Empire? It seemed unthinkable. How could it ever happen? The Romans mastered the art of plumbing and built water supply and sewer systems, perhaps only slightly inferior to ours. Some of them still function, and I've seen them. Sewer systems like the Cloaca Maxima in Rome were large enough to drive a wagon through. Some of the rich had furnaces under their houses with warm air circulating through pipes or ducts in the walls. Of course, that method is still used in homes built today, if the buyer and builder want to do that. Water was everywhere, supplied by fantastic aqueducts over long distances, many, many miles. That water would flow down those aqueducts, which were slanted at just the right angle to flow right on into the place where the reservoir was, and the water would be made available to the inhabitants of the city. Hot and cold water public baths were a must to the Romans. There were over 800 public baths in the city of Rome itself. And we could go on. This is an amazing revelation to anyone who will open their ears and eyes and look at the facts of the history of the Roman Empire and learn the lessons from its decline and fall. We're going to go into this subject extensively, not to try to draw exact parallels between ancient Rome and the Western world, but to sound a warning about some of the same mistakes they made, which are now being made today in America, Britain, and the rest of the Western world. Rome started to crumble internally. Now, why did they start to crumble internally? They could not be defeated externally. They were too powerful. They had too many modern weapons of war, too many tactics and strategies of war that were way ahead of their time. They simply could not be overrun externally. But what happened that started the downward spiral in the mighty Roman Empire is that it began to crumble internally. And the number one problem that caused this eventual collapse internally was that the family unit started to fall apart. The family unit in ancient Rome started to come apart at the seams. Does this sound familiar today? I want to continue reading in this booklet, The Modern Romans, that addresses this point of the home, foundation of greatness or decadence. Youthful rebellion, the generation gap, student unrest, juvenile delinquency, illegitimacy, sexual revolution, pot, escapism—these are the social problems plaguing today's youth and modern society. and fueling much of it is a radically changing family lifestyle. Some authorities even predict the disappearance of the traditional family unit. Today, divorces are a more and more commonly accepted part of modern living styles. Rampant adultery, premarital sex, perverted sex, they're all tearing away at stable home life and happiness in the Western world. Largely forgotten today is the fact that the home is the basic foundation of any society. It is the most influential element in national character. It lays the first groundwork for learning individual character, values, goals, morality, self-control, and loyalty. The early Romans basically understood this, and it was a force that helped Rome grow in power and stature. In the book Rome, Its Rise and Fall, the author, Philip Van Ness Myers, notes, quote, "First, at the bottom, as it were, of Roman society and forming its ultimate unit was the family. The most important feature or element of this family group was the authority of the father figure, which is being impugned, ridiculed, and dismissed in our society today, and it got to where that same thing happened in Roman society. It would be difficult, continuing, to overestimate the influence of this group upon the history and destiny of Rome," this author says. Philip Van Ness Myers. It was the cradle of at least some of those splendid virtues of the early Romans that contributed so much to the strength and greatness of Rome and that helped give her dominion of the world. That's from his book, Rome, Its Rise and Fall. Continuing now to read from this booklet. This same strong family structure with the father in leadership was a foundation stone supporting the national power of the British Empire and the United States in their zeniths of greatness. We use the word was because, as it did in Rome, this building block of national power, the strong family unit, is rapidly deteriorating, and it is. Note what's happening in the headlines coming out of Britain, for instance. Children are taking over. The traditional values and standards that hold the family unit together are being thrown aside, and father being in charge and leading and providing is becoming antiquated and tossed overboard. And as a result, the family unit is falling apart in so many instances. But not only in Britain, the same thing is happening in the U.S. and the rest of the world, and that's what happened in ancient Rome. Will we learn that lesson? This historian continued, quote, "It was in the atmosphere of the family that were nourished in the Roman youth the virtues of obedience and of deference to authority. When the youth became a citizen, obedience to magistrates and respect for law was in him as instinct and indeed almost a religion. And on the other hand, the exercise of the parental authority in the family taught the Roman how to command as well as how to obey, how to exercise authority with wisdom, moderation, and justice," end quote. We have had other leading figures in our country sound the alarm over many years, as well as some sounding the alarm in the day of the Roman Empire. Historians record that. Notice an observation from a very famous American crime fighter, the late J. Edgar Hoover. Notice what he said. He emphasized before the Special Senate Committee investigating organized crime in interstate commerce this way, quote, "The home is the first great training school in behavior or misbehavior, and parents serve as the first teachers for the inspirational education of youth. In the home, the child learns, or should learn, that others besides himself have rights which he must respect. Here, the spade work is laid for instilling in the child those values which will cause him to develop into an upright, law-abiding, wholesome citizen. He must learn respect for others, respect for property, courtesy, truthfulness, and reliability. He must learn not only to manage his own affairs, but also to share in the responsibility for the affairs of the community. He must be taught to understand the necessity of obeying the laws of God," end quote, so said the late J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. Those are powerful and very true words. Now continuing to read a little further in this booklet, The Modern Romans. Early Roman parents, far from being perfect examples of parenthood, nevertheless basically realized their responsibility in nation building. They didn't leave the teaching of basic morals and responsibilities to others. E.B. Castle, in his book Ancient Education and Today, said this, "The early Roman boy's upbringing was founded on a profound conviction of the power of example, first of the father himself," notice the father figure, "of the father himself as a representative of virtues peculiarly Roman. but also of the great prototypes of Roman valor in the boy's family and national history who were presented to him as men worthy of admiration. Continuing in this booklet. Contrary to the situation in modern America today, the early Romans had exemplary heroes and living examples of what youth are expected to emulate. And strange though it may sound to many a modern woman, mothers and homemakers in early Rome were accorded great honor and esteem, and they used to be in our country, and they still are in some quarters. But increasingly they're ridiculed, made fun of, and labeled as inferior or limited or even enslaved in a sense. That wasn't true in the Roman Empire in its day. Mothers and homemakers were honored greatly and held in high esteem, and they should be in our country today without exception. Here's what Tacitus, a Roman historian of the early empire, wrote. In the good old days of the Republic, every man's son born in wedlock was brought up not in the chamber of some hireling nurse, but in his mother's lap and at her knee. And that mother could have no higher praise than that she managed the house and gave herself to her children. And that's what the Bible teaches, and that's the way it ought to be everywhere. But it isn't. That appreciation for the outstanding duties, responsibilities, and honorable accomplishments of wife and motherhood is shrinking and has all but disappeared today in the Western world. Continuing with what Tacitus, Dialogue on Oratory 28, said, that's where he wrote this, religiously and with the utmost delicacy, she regulated not only the serious task of her youthful charges, but their recreations also and their games. He was referring to Rome at its zenith. But the home in Rome began to collapse. And that then started to lead to the collapse of the Roman Empire itself. That was one of the major reasons why Rome fell. Not the only one, but one of the major ones. And that's one of the major problems we have in our declining Western world today, internally speaking. One other section from this booklet. By the beginning of the 2nd century A.D., Roman fathers in general had yielded to the impulse to become far too complacent. Having given up the habit of controlling their children, they let the children govern them, and took pleasure in bleeding themselves white to gratify the expensive whims of their offspring. The result was that they were succeeded by a generation of idlers and wastrels. Jerome Carcopino, in his book Daily Life in Ancient Rome, says this, the fine edge of character had been blunted in the Rome of the 2nd century A.D. The stern face of the traditional father of the family had faded out. Instead, we see on every hand the flabby face of the son of the house, the eternal spoiled child of society, who has grown accustomed to luxury and lost all sense of discipline. So says this Roman historian of society in ancient Rome as it began to decline. So a breakdown in authority in the typical Roman home set in, which led to the breakdown of the family unit, which eventually led to the breakdown of Roman civilization itself, and then came the end of the great Roman Empire. Can we see the same trend fully developing and underway in America and Britain today, and in the rest of the Western world? This wrong direction must be reversed if we are to avoid the same fate that the mighty Roman Empire suffered. This change of direction starts in the home and in the family. Many authorities recognize the fact that as goes the family, so goes the nation. The family is the cradle of culture. That's where culture is learned. It's the strength of the nation. That's where leadership is developed. And it's the stronghold of civilization. That's where unity is maintained in the family. Notice what Winston Churchill said about the family when he spoke on the birth of Prince Charles, November 16, 1948. Here's what the renowned Mr. Churchill said. There's no doubt that it is around the family and the home that all the greatest virtues, the most dominating virtues of human society, are created, strengthened, and maintained. You know what that means? That means if the family falls apart, then the greatest virtues of human society fall apart as well. And that's exactly what's taking place. Will we admit it? Can we see it? Do we care? Those are the questions that each of us have to face. Now, what does the ultimate authority on this subject of the family unit say? God in His holy word, the Bible. Is there anything in the Bible about the prophesied falling apart of the family unit in today's modern world? And can we tie that in with the lessons of the falling apart of the family unit in the quote-unquote eternal Roman Empire? I hope we can. Let's just notice what the Bible says about this in one place, and it says it in other places. But notice this place, Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 5. Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 5. Here's a prophecy that applies to us today. And the people shall be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his neighbor. Well, you see that happening more and more in the streets and highways and byways of America and in other places in the world. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient or the elderly, and the base against the honorable. In other words, children begin to be dominant. They rebel. They go their own way. They do what they want to. They say what they want to. They act the way they want to. They're not under authority. They have no guidelines. They're quote-unquote no borders. Get out of my way. I'll be what I want to be and do what I want to do. And they rebuff and reject authority in the home, in the school, and in society in general. Why? Is it their fault? It's partly their fault, but mainly it's the fault of parents abrogating their responsibility. Parents are walking away from being parents. They're too busy doing their own thing, going their own way, being their own person. Marriages are breaking up. There's upside-down structure in the home. There are no guidelines and directions and stability and togetherness that takes place. Now, some homes are an exception to that, but the growing majority of homes and family units are exactly that way. They're topsy-turvy. There's no direction. There is no cohesion. There's a breakdown taking place. Taking a leaf out of the book of ancient Rome, that will lead to the breakdown of our society just like it did in their society. There's one other prophecy I want to turn to. It's found in the New Testament, and it applies directly to our day. It's found over here in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1. It says, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come." The last days. There's only one time that can be characterized as the last days, and we're living in those last days before Christ comes back to this earth. Last days, as a figure of speech, there could be several more years, but it's speaking of the end time. "For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers." Don't we see that around us today? Look at the mounting economic and social and political ills that we are hearing about on a daily basis, and see if what we just read there in verse 2 of 2 Timothy 3 is not a prophecy that's coming to pass today. It is. Continuing. "Disobedient to parents. Disobedient to authorities in general. Unthankful, unholy, without natural affection. Even among family members, without that love and that affection and that appreciation and that family cohesion and that standing by one another. It's disappearing. Truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God." How true! The pursuit of pleasure and escapism, sports, movies, entertainment of all kinds, worshiping of celebrities, etc., but leaving God totally out of the picture. Verse 5, "Having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away." The breakup of marriage, the breakup of home, the neglect of parental child rearing and proper loving discipline, this all leads to the family unit cracking and then dissolving. And that's exactly what leads to the cracking internally and dissolution of any civilization and great powerful nation throughout history. Just check it and you'll see that's exactly what starts the ball rolling downhill that turns into an avalanche. It's not the only problem, but it's one of the biggest problems, this matter of family breakdown. It happened in ancient Rome. It's happening in the modern Western world. But what can we do about this problem? Is there anything? Yes, we can be a committee of one to get our home, our house, and our family in order, to bring back God and His Word to the center of life in our home, to throw out the rotten, evil, corrosive influences that have infiltrated the family unit, and replace that rot, that filth, that utterly selfish and valueless lifestyle promoted in the world today at large. To throw that out and replace it with good, clean, wholesome values, the abundant life, hard work, sturdy standards, and an unquenchable appetite to achieve and produce good things that are right in God's sight and good for other people. Replace all the rot with that approach, that way of life. That's what we can do in the face of all of the problems we see around us today. It has to do with bringing God's way of life back into our home and into our family. This must start with the adults and parents, and then quickly be picked up and followed by the children. And it must be required of the children. Happiness, success, and unity will then blossom in your family life and start to spread to others as well. Joshua said it as well as it could be said in his day, and it applies to all of us today just as much as it did then. Let's turn over here to the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 24 and verse 14. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. If we can bring that back into our home and into our family and spread it throughout our community and our society and our civilization, all of the hopeless and mounting problems that are not just a mountain now, they're a whole mountain range of problems, can be overcome, can be solved, and we can move forward the way God intends us to move forward. But if this doesn't happen, we're going to go the way of Rome. It's only a matter of time. But it doesn't have to happen to you and your family if you will do this. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve you the Eternal. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Eternal, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Eternal. There's the choice. And God puts that choice before us. And each individual can make that choice. Am I going to go the way of the world, or am I going to go the way of God? Am I going to go the way of continuing decay and utter collapse, or am I going to go the way of growing and thriving and success, which is God's way? We've got to do that individually, we've got to do that in our homes, and we've got to do that nationally and internationally, or what we read about in history concerning the great, the mighty, the powerful, the seemingly unassailable Roman Empire, its rise, its decline and fall, is exactly what is going to happen to the Western world. Until next time, this is Charles Bryce with the Enduring Church of God.